Now, there's a number of contemporary accounts also that are really quite fascinating, and also that we have to, I think, take very carefully in this context that I'm trying to explain it. There's the story of the enigmatic Mr. Janus, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Prince Philip, who's still alive, he's quite elderly at this point and well into his 90s, has had a lifelong interest in UFOs. And during the 1950s and for many years after that, was very close with a gentleman named Sir Peter Horsley, who in his own right is was a fascinating man, a very capable guy. And it's not hard to see why he would have the confidence of someone like the Prince. Horsley, on behalf of Prince Philip and his powerful interest in UFOs, did some research on the side for the Prince back in the 1950s. And on one occasion in 1954, had an encounter in London in an apartment with a gentleman identified only as Mr. Janus. This is not a photograph of Mr. Janus. I want to point this out. This is a Shutterstock image that I looked and looked and looked for an image that encapsulates this man as best as I could find. And I think this captures him. The only difference being that this gentleman here looks a bit older than the Mr. Janus as described by Horsley. The Mr. Janus that Horsley described was like 40. So really in kind of is a bit younger than this man. Having said that, this is a fascinating story. And Horsley had a long conversation with this man who sat in a chair and talked with him and Horsley was convinced that he was an extraterrestrial and was convinced for the rest of his life. Horsley lived past the year 2000. He was quite elderly when he passed away and was convinced that this was an extraterrestrial. He was convinced that Mr. Janus could read his mind. And Mr. Janus talked to him about where, the low level of the human race at this time and how the extraterrestrials were looking at us at this time, and as if he were an extraterrestrial. And Horsley, who I believe was a high-level RAF fighter pilot and he's one of those like MacGyver type guys, who was just skilled at everything. He was not someone that you would think could have the wool pulled over his eyes easily at all. He was a very, very astute man who had seen a lot of the world. Horsley was absolutely convinced that this Mr. Janus figure was not human. So that's one example of many of these human-looking non-humans. Then you have the amazing story of Ingo Swann, the remote viewer, and his encounter with the mysterious Mr. Axelrod. I was lucky. I had the good fortune of talking directly with Ingo many years ago about this encounter. And I was lucky to spend an evening in the home of Ingo Swann way back in 2000, I think it was 2003. And I really liked and respected Ingo Swann. And he was a brilliant man, incidentally, and an amazing library. But back in the mid-70s, Ingo had an encounter with a man known only as Axelrod. And I've talked about this. I wrote about this at length in volume 2 of UFOs in a National Security State. But essentially, this is another case of what I think firmly was human-looking non-humans operating here quietly on Earth. And I'll just say there were people very close to Ingo who absolutely believed that Mr. Axelrod was a human-looking non-human. I don't know if Ingo believed it, but people to him, close to him, who in the intelligence community seem to have believed it. And then, I've collected a number of stories and other researchers of telepathic humans, that they look like us, but they're not like us. There's too many of these. So I think what can explain these accounts? All right. Well, I think what we must conclude, is that there is an active presence of human-looking beings who are not like us. All right. And I think they started when they were taken 40,000 years ago. So I've made this point a few times. I think I can move on. They live apart from us. They're monitoring us. They've probably been around us for a while. I don't know if they would have enjoyed living among us in medieval Europe. Who the heck knows? Or ancient China. I don't know. But maybe they lived among us all this time, or maybe not. There's a lot that I feel we don't know that we can say about them, but I think they have been here and they are here. Now, there's a couple of other possibilities here, and I just want to point this out. There's a possibility that, like as we saw in the movie Avatar, that maybe ETs can use human bodies as Avatar. One of the very brilliant members of my website put this out as an idea, and I think it's a worth consideration. If we can take seriously the idea that these beings can manipulate souls, and there are stories about souls being extracted and put into temporary containers, as crazy as it sounds, if that is true, if the technology exists, if there is an ethereal, non-physical part of us that can be captured, put in a type of Faraday cage, I don't know. If that is true, if there's an ability for them to manipulate human bodies in that manner, and to incorporate, or in, I guess we could say, come into a human body, then that's a technology that we would have to consider. And there's a third. There's the hybrid/hubrid theory that people like Professor David Jacobs have talked about, which I'm going to get into that in a moment when we get into the grays. This idea of creating human-looking hybrids. And in fact, I think that is true as far as it goes. I just don't think it's complete. I don't think that the hybrid theory is the complete explanation for human-looking non-humans. My final thought on this before I move on. I'm just warning, I'm telling my wife, and I'm telling Lori and Michael, I'm telling you, I'm probably going to go a little over from the 90 minutes. I'm not going to go so over that I blow out the AMA session that follows, but I'm going to take this as long as I need to take it. I'm just letting everybody know here. My final thought on these human-like aliens. They look like us. They basically have our genetics. There has got to be some differences, but they are not like us in certain critical areas. That is intellectually, that is telepathically, that is probably physically. You know, the sighting from Mobile, Alabama, where they were very slender and had large chests, that could very well be different genetics, that genetic tweaking and so forth. Maybe they were designer babies, like, you know, what the next generation of humans wants to create. Their science is different from ours. Their culture is different from ours. And by the way, when I talked in the previous lecture, if you were here for that, on the fourth stage of humanity, this kind of development toward one big ant colony of humanity. I mean, I speak about that pejoratively, but maybe I shouldn't. Maybe that's just the way it's supposed to be, that we become a big collective, that we're all connected to each other in some way. You know, all of the abductees who talk about AT capabilities talk about them being telepathic and all being connected into kind of like a, you know, like in the Star Trek Borg scenario, like in a Borg-like reality. Maybe that's the future. I don't think I like that future. I don't think I want that future for me or for my family or for you, but frankly, my desires don't factor into what's probably going to happen. So, but anyway, that very well may be, like, their culture is very likely different from ours in those key ways. Now, I think it's very likely, if I were told to give an intelligence briefing to some government agency, I would say you should expect that they have agents working deep cover, full time, as us. And I think we have to assume that they find our infrastructure, our society, very interesting and important enough for them now to be concerned. All right. 500 years ago, no way, not at all. We were not that interesting 500 years ago. We sure as hell are interesting now. And I think that's what we have to recognize. We have to take ourselves seriously as a society and recognize we have genuine capabilities now that other groups out there need to be alert to.